The noise inside the terminal was not just loud, it was heavy. It pressed down on everyone like a thick, invisible blanket made of stress, announcements, and the shuffling of thousands of feet. It was 6 p.m. on a Tuesday, which is widely known as the worst time to be in an airport. Everyone was tired. Everyone was in a hurry. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee, floor wax, and the sharp, metallic scent of jet fuel that drifted in from the tarmac. Overhead, the massive television silently flickered with news and weather maps, while the speakers crackled every few minutes with a robotic voice, announcing gate changes or delayed flights. In the middle of this enormous hall, people moved like water in a fast-flowing river. They were rushing to gates, running to bathrooms, or standing in long, unmoving lines at security. If you stopped and looked around, you could see the exhaustion on their faces. There was a businessman with a loosened tie, dragging a roller bag behind him as he spoke angrily into his phone. There was a young mother trying to balance a crying baby on one hip and a heavy diaper bag on the other. There were elderly couples holding hands, looking confusedly at the departure boards, trying to figure out where they were supposed to be. Nobody looked at anyone else. In a place so full of people, it was strange how lonely it felt. Everyone was trapped in their own little bubble, worrying about their own flight, their own luggage, and their own problems. The terminal was a gray, concrete box designed for efficiency, not for feeling. But right in the center of all this chaos, there was something that didn't quite belong. It was a grand piano. It was a beautiful, sleek, shiny black instrument that looked completely out of place against the harsh background of metal seats in duty-free shops. It sat there on a slightly raised platform, bathed in a warm yellow spotlight that made it look like a stage. It was a public piano put there by the airport to add a little bit of culture to the travel experience. It had a small brass plaque on the side that said, "Play Me," inviting anyone passing by to sit down and make some music. However, for the last 4 hours, nobody had touched it. It stood silent and empty, almost like a ghost. To most of the travelers, it wasn't an instrument. It was just another piece of furniture, like a bench or a potted plant. People sat on the benches nearby to tie their shoes or check their emails, resting their coffee cups on the floor near the pedals. Suitcases were wheeled dangerously close to its polished legs. It was invisible. The piano was waiting for a story to happen, but the airport was too busy for stories. Everyone was just passing through, moving from point A to point B, treating the terminal as a bridge they had to cross rather than a place to be. The atmosphere felt mechanical. The sound of wheels rolling over the tiled floor created a constant low-pitched rumble that never stopped. Every now and then, a laugh would ring out, or a child would scream, but it was quickly swallowed up by the vastness of the ceiling. The ceiling itself was incredibly high, made of steel beams and glass, making the people below feel small and insignificant. It was a place designed for transit, for leaving, for arriving, but never for staying. The emotional vibe of the terminal was numbness. People were used to waiting, so they just stared at their screens, scrolling through social media or reading work emails, trying to zone out the world around them. Then something changed. It wasn't a sudden announcement or a loud alarm. It was much quieter than that. Out of the river of rushing people, one man broke away. He didn't look like he was in a hurry anymore. He stopped walking right in the middle of the walkway, which caused a few people to grumble and swerve around him, annoyed. But he didn't notice them. He was looking at the piano. The man looked to be in his late 70s. He wasn't dressed like a businessman or a wealthy tourist. He was wearing a simple, old-fashioned tweed coat that had seen better days. The elbows were slightly worn, and the color had faded from years of use. On his head, he wore a flat cap that cast a shadow over his eyes. He had a kind face, lined with deep wrinkles that told the story of a life full of smiles and perhaps a few sorrows. He carried a small, battered suitcase that looked like it had traveled the world with him. It wasn't one of those modern, hard-shell suitcases. It was soft leather, scuffed at the corners, with old stickers from airports that don't even exist anymore. He stood there for a moment, just watching the piano. He took a deep breath, as if he was inhaling the air of the terminal, and slowly let it out. He adjusted his coat, pulling it tighter around himself against the chill of the air conditioning. Then, he stepped off the main path. He walked toward the instrument with a slow, deliberate pace. His shoes made a soft clicking sound on the floor. Click. Click, a sound that was different from the heavy thud of running shoes or the rumble of suitcases. As he got closer, the people sitting on the nearby benches didn't pay him any attention. They assumed he was just another tired traveler looking for a place to sit. Maybe they thought he was going to rest his feet or make a phone call. He reached the platform and stood before the piano. He reached out a hand. His hand was weathered, the skin thin and spotted with age, but it moved with grace. He didn't sit down immediately. He ran his fingers gently over the smooth black lid of the piano. He touched it like it was something precious, like he was greeting an old friend he hadn't seen in 40 years. There was a gentleness in the way he moved that seemed to slow down the time around him. The rush of the airport was still happening. People were still running. Flights were still boarding, but around this small platform things felt different. He looked at the keys, which were dusty under the bright lights. He pulled out a white handkerchief from his pocket and wiped the keys softly, cleaning away the dust. It was a small act, but it showed respect. He wasn't treating this like a joke. He was treating it like a sacred duty. He set his old suitcase down on the floor next to the bench. It landed with a soft thud, staying upright like a loyal dog. He looked around one last time, his eyes scanning the crowd. But he wasn't looking at anyone in particular. He seemed to be looking inside himself, preparing. He adjusted his cuffs, rolling them up slightly to free his wrists. He sat down on the bench. It was a heavy wooden bench, and it creaked slightly under his weight. He shifted his position, getting comfortable, moving closer to the keys. The people nearby were starting to notice now. It's hard not to notice when someone sits at a piano. A teenager with headphones looked up from his phone, curious to see if this old man was actually going to play or just bang on the keys. A woman drinking a latte glanced over, wondering if he was going to be annoying. A few travelers slowed their walking pace, craning their necks to see what was happening. The tension in the air was subtle. Everyone was waiting to see if this would be a disruption to their day or a moment to ignore. The man placed his hands on the keys. They hovered there for a second, trembling just slightly. The piano was cold under his fingers, but he didn't mind. He closed his eyes for a brief second, shutting out the noise of the announcements, the crowds, and the fluorescent lights. In that moment, he wasn't in a busy airport terminal anymore. He was in his own world, a world where only music existed. He took another deep breath, filling his lungs, and then let it out slowly through his nose. He pressed down on a key. It wasn't a chord yet. It was just a single, deep note. A low C that resonated through the wooden body of the instrument and hummed into the air. The sound was surprisingly clear and loud, cutting through the dull roar of the airport background noise. It was like a stone dropped into a still pond. The note hung in the air, vibrating, demanding to be heard. The businessman on the phone stopped talking for a second, puzzled by the sound. The mother with the crying baby paused to listen. The man didn't stop. His fingers found the next note, slow and deliberate. He wasn't playing a song yet. He was testing the waters, waking the piano up. He played a few simple scales, his fingers stiff at first, but quickly loosening up. The sound was rich and warm, filling the cold space around him. It wasn't the sound of a street performer trying to make money. It was the sound of a master craftsman checking his tools. Then his hand settled into position. The left hand dropped low, and the right hand rose up. He took a moment of absolute silence, a pause that felt like an eternity to those watching. The crowd was growing now. More people were stopping. A security guard, who usually spent his time telling people to move along, stood still and watched. The man's posture changed. He straightened his back. The weary look on his face vanished, replaced by a look of intense concentration and peace. He looked strong. He looked ready. The terminal was still chaotic. Flights were still boarding. The coffee machine was still steaming, but a small bubble of silence had formed around the piano. The gray mechanical world of the airport was being challenged by the black, organic shape of the instrument and the old man sitting at it. The gray rush was still flowing around them, but the current had slowed. He was about to play. And everyone could feel that something special was about to happen. The air in the terminal shifted the moment the man's hands finally committed to the keys. For a long second, there was only the sound of the airport, the rolling suitcase wheels, the distant announcement of a flight to Berlin, the cough of a man standing near the pillars. But then, the man struck the keys. He didn't start soft. He didn't try to sneak his way into the background noise. Instead, his right hand came down firmly on a cluster of notes that rang out like a bell cutting through fog. It was a sharp, clear, piercing sound that seemed to grab the ears of everyone within a 50-foot radius. The sound that came out of that sleek, black instrument was not the clumsy banging you might expect from a bored traveler messing around. It was precise. It was professional. The tone was rich and full, vibrating through the wood and bouncing off the high ceiling of the terminal. It was a sound that demanded respect. When you hear a cheap piano, it sounds like a toy. But this piano, under this man's hands, sounded like a living, breathing beast. The initial chord hung in the air for a moment, shimmering and fading slowly, and in that moment, the mechanical hum of the airport seemed to dip in volume. People reacted instinctively. It's human nature to turn toward a sudden, loud noise. A businessman who was furiously typing an email on his laptop froze. His fingers stopped moving over the keys, hovering in midair. He didn't turn his head all the way, just a sharp tilt to the left. His brain trying to process if this noise was a disruption or something else. A young woman with large headphones over her ears was bobbing her head to music only she could hear. But the sound from the piano was strong enough to cut through her isolation. She pulled one ear cup off and looked around, confused. Wondering where the music was coming from, the man on the bench didn't open his eyes. He didn't look around to see if he had an audience. He was locked in. His hands, which had looked so fragile and weathered when he was just standing there, suddenly transformed. They moved with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for his age. His fingers were long and slender, and they danced across the white and black ivory keys like they were weightless. He started to play a melody that was complicated and fast. It wasn't a nursery rhyme, and it wasn't a pop song everyone knew on the radio. It sounded classical, full of twists and turns. It was a run of notes that cascaded down the scale like water tumbling over rocks in a stream. The rhythm was steady and driving. It had a heartbeat to it. Thump, thump, thump went the left hand, laying down a foundation, while the right hand spun out intricate webs of sound above it. The effect on the crowd was immediate and physical. Up until this point, the people in the terminal were moving with the hurried, jerky movements of stressed travelers. They were walking fast, checking watches, frowning. But the music acted like a brake. It was as if someone had pressed a slow-motion button on the remote control of the world. People who were walking past the piano found their steps slowing down involuntarily. The rhythm of the music seemed to get into their legs, syncing with their pace. A group of teenagers who were laughing and shouting near a coffee shop went quiet. One of them nudged another and pointed toward the piano. They stopped walking and formed a loose semicircle, their faces turning from bored to curious. They weren't the only ones. A janitor pushing a large yellow mop bucket stopped in the middle of the aisle. He leaned against the handle of the bucket, resting his chin on his hands, completely forgetting about the wet floor sign he was supposed to put down. The music was giving everyone permission to pause. In a place where time is usually measured by minutes and seconds, the music was stretching time out, making it feel fluid and wide. The musician's face was a picture of pure concentration. He wasn't smiling and he wasn't frowning. He looked peaceful, but there was an intensity in his expression, like he was solving a very difficult math problem in his head, while his hands did the work. A small vein in his temple pulsed slightly with the effort. Every now and then, his eyebrows would furrow when he hit a particularly difficult series of notes, and then smooth out again as the melody resolved. He swayed slightly back and forth with the music, his body rocking to the rhythm. It looked like he was in a trance, or maybe he was remembering something from a long time ago. He wasn't playing for the people standing there. He was playing for the piano and for himself. The sound itself was filling up the huge space. Airports are designed to eat sound, to absorb voices and noises so that they don't echo too much. But a grand piano is different. It projects. The music traveled up to the second-floor balconies where people were looking down over the railing. You could see them looking over the edge, trying to spot the source of the sound. Down on the ground floor, the music wove through the lines of people waiting at the check-in counters. Even the airport staff, people who usually tune everything out because they have heard it all 1,000 times before, were turning their heads. One man in a pilot's uniform was walking briskly toward the gates. He had his bag slung over his shoulder and his eyes straight ahead, focused on getting to his plane on time. He walked right past the piano without looking. But after a few steps, the music caught up to him. He stopped. He turned around slowly. He saw the old man in the tweed coat, saw the hands flying over the keys. The pilot checked his watch, looked at his gate on the screen, and then took a step back toward the piano. He couldn't just walk away. The music had hooked him. He stood there, one hand on his bag strap, listening with a look of genuine appreciation on his face. The piece the man was playing shifted. It started to get louder and more dramatic. The low notes were getting heavier, vibrating the floor just enough that you could feel it in your feet if you stood close enough. The high notes were sparkling like champagne bubbles. The contrast was beautiful. It was a conversation between two different voices, the deep, steady bass and the flighty, dancing treble. The old man's foot pressed down on the sustained pedal, holding the notes out, letting them blend together into a warm wash of sound that enveloped the crowd by now. A small but definite crowd had formed. It wasn't a mob. It was just a collection of people who had been snagged by the melody. They stood at a respectful distance, not wanting to disturb the man. They were a mix of all different kinds of people, old, young, rich, poor, from all different countries. For a few minutes, the barriers between them came down. Usually, in an airport, you avoid eye contact. You try to pretend the hundreds of strangers around you don't exist. But now, people were looking at each other. They were catching each other's eyes and smiling. They were sharing a look that said, "Asterisk, can you believe this? This is amazing." It's asterisk. A little girl, no more than 5 years old, broke away from her mother's hand. She was wearing a bright pink coat and clutching a stuffed teddy bear. She walked right up to the edge of the piano platform, undisturbed by the social rules of personal space. She stood there, her mouth slightly open, watching the man's hands. Her eyes were wide with wonder. To her, it must have looked like magic. She didn't see the technique or the years of practice. She just saw the hands moving so fast they were almost a blur, and she heard the beautiful sounds that came out. Her mother watched from a few feet back, smiling, and didn't call her back. Even the child could sense that this was a special moment that shouldn't be interrupted. The musician played a run of notes that was so fast it sounded like a waterfall. It was a flurry of sound that made the crowd gasp audibly. A collective intake of breath washed over the room. It was a moment of pure virtuosity, a display of skill that reminds you that human beings are capable of incredible things. The old man's face remained calm, but his fingers were working hard. They were hammering the keys now, but with a touch that was still controlled, never banging or sounding harsh. He was in total command of the instrument. The music swelled again, rising to a crest, and then suddenly the volume dropped. The man lifted his hands off the low notes and moved to the high, delicate keys at the top of the piano. The sound became soft, like a whisper. It was a trick of dynamics control, the loudness and softness that forced the audience to lean in. People stopped shuffling their feet. The silence in the room grew heavier, but in a good way. It was a focused silence. You could hear the soft clicking of the piano keys over the hum of the air conditioning now. The contrast between the loud, busy airport and this quiet, intimate music was stark. The man was playing with emotion now. You could hear it in the phrasing, the way he lingered on certain notes, just a fraction of a second longer, making them sound sad or longing. The music felt like a story without words. It sounded like a memory of a beautiful place, or maybe a goodbye. It resonated with everyone in the terminal because, in a way, everyone there was in the middle of a story saying goodbye to family, going home, leaving for a new job. The music tapped into that universal feeling of transition that defines an airport. He transitioned into a section of the song that was rhythmic and jazzy. The left hand kept a steady, bouncing beat while the right hand played syncopated melodies that landed just off the beat, surprising the ear. It was a playful sound. A few people in the crowd started tapping their feet. One man, who had his arms crossed over his chest tightly, let his arms drop to his sides. His shoulders, which had been hunched up around. As the melody continued to grow, the effect on the terminal began to deepen. It wasn't just a matter of people stopping to listen for a few seconds anymore. The music was creating a physical shift in the atmosphere. Like a stone dropped in a pond, creating ripples that spread outward in every direction. The sound of the piano was no longer just competing with the noise of the airport. It was starting to win. The constant mechanical hum of the ventilation systems, the rolling of suitcase wheels, the distant chatter of crowds, it all seemed to fade into the background, becoming nothing more than soft static compared to the clear, singing voice of the piano. The music the old man was playing had a distinct character to it. It wasn't stiff or classical in a boring way. It was flowing and romantic, but it also had a heartbeat to it. It was the kind of music that makes you want to close your eyes and remember things. It had a blue feeling, a kind of sweet sadness mixed with hope. The melody would climb up high, sounding bright and cheerful like a sunny day, and then slide back down into the low notes, sounding deep and thoughtful like a quiet conversation at night. This contrast in the music was reaching people. It was bypassing their ears and going straight to their hearts. The ripple effect was moving through the crowd in waves. Near the back of the area, a man in a sharp gray suit was pacing back and forth. He was clearly agitated, checking his watch every 10 seconds and shouting into his phone about a misconnection. He was the picture of modern stressed-out shoulders, red face, clenched jaw. But as the music drifted toward him, his pacing slowed. He didn't realize it was happening at first. He just took a step, then another, but they weren't the angry stomping steps he had been taking a minute ago. The melody wrapped around him. He stopped shouting into the phone. He lowered the device from his ear and just stood there. The angry tension in his face melted away, replaced by a look of confusion and then calm. The music was forcing him to breathe, forcing him to slow down. He put the phone in his pocket without ending the call, forgetting the business deal entirely, and turned to face the sound. Further away. Near the large glass windows that looked out onto the runway, a young couple was sitting on the floor. They looked like backpackers. Their bags were sprawled around them. They were sitting with their backs against the cold glass, looking exhausted and defeated. They weren't talking to each other. The fatigue of travel had clearly taken its toll, and they were lost in their own miserable thoughts. But as the music floated over, the young woman lifted her head. She looked toward the piano, a faint smile touching her lips. She nudged the young man next to her with her elbow. He looked up, rubbed his eyes, and followed her gaze. They didn't get up. They just sat there, leaning against each other, listening. The music seemed to give them a second wind. It reminded them that they were on an adventure together, and the exhaustion didn't matter so much anymore. Around the piano, the crowd was becoming dense. The semicircle of people was widening, but people were also pressing in closer, trying to see the hands that were creating such magic. It was a strange mix of humanity that you would never see together anywhere else. There was a police officer standing next to a hippie with a guitar case on his back. There was an elderly woman in a wheelchair holding hands with a little boy who was dressed in a suit and tie. There were people of every color, speaking every language, standing shoulder to shoulder. In the airport, these people usually passed like ships in the night, separated by their destinations and their own private worlds. But the music had dissolved those walls. For this moment, they were just one group of humans, united by the sound. The ripple effect reached the upper levels too. Up on the second floor, where the walkways looked down over the main hall like a balcony, people were stopping at the railing. They were leaning over, looking down at the black piano and the tiny figure of the man in the tweed coat. It was a strange sight from above a sea of heads, all facing one direction. Perfectly still, in the middle of a busy transit hub. A few people pulled out their phones, not to record a video, but just to take a picture, as if they wanted proof that this moment actually happened. They wanted to capture the feeling of the air, knowing that a photograph wouldn't really do it justice. The old man on the bench was oblivious to all of this. He was lost in the landscape of the music. He was playing a complex, sweeping run of notes that required his hands to cross over each other constantly. His left hand jumped up to play the high notes while his right hand dove down to the bass. It was a physical workout. You could see the muscles in his forearms flexing and releasing under the sleeves of his old coat. He was sweating now, not heavily, but there was a shine on his forehead. But he didn't look tired. He looked energized. It was as if the piano was giving him power rather than taking it away. He was breathing deeply, his chest rising and falling in time with the phrases of the music. The emotional weight of the performance was heavy. It wasn't just entertainment. It was a sharing of soul. The man played a soft, gentle passage that was so tender it made people want to cry. The notes were delicate, like glass. In that quiet moment, you could see the emotions washing over the crowd. A woman in a red coat standing near the front reached up and dabbed her eye with a tissue. A man with a gray beard crossed his arms over his chest and squeezed tight, closing his eyes as if he was remembering a lost love or a home he hadn't seen in years. The music was tapping into the collective loneliness of the airport. Everyone here was leaving someone or going to meet someone. Everyone was in a state of transition. The music understood that. It sounded like goodbye and hello all at the same time. Suddenly, the tempo picked up. The gentle sadness vanished, replaced by a driving, energetic rhythm. The man's foot worked the pedals like a machine, pumping sustain and then cutting it off sharp. The sound became percussive and loud. It was a jazzy, upbeat rhythm that made you want to tap your foot. The energy in the room shifted instantly. The sadness lifted, and a feeling of excitement took over. People started to smile. It was amazing to watch hundreds of strangers, all smiling at the same time, looking at each other with shared delight. The music was taking them on a roller coaster. And everyone was holding on for the ride. Even the airport staff, who were usually trained to be invisible and focused on logistics, were getting swept up in it. A woman who worked at the coffee stand had stepped out from behind the counter. She was holding a cloth she was using to wipe the tables, but she wasn't wiping anything. She was just standing there, the cloth hanging limp in her hand, watching the old man. Two security guards who were having a conversation by the metal detectors stopped talking. They took off their hats and held them against their chests, standing respectfully. Even they could tell that this was not the time to worry about rules or procedures. This was a rare human moment that deserved respect. The sound was filling the huge space completely now. The acoustics of the terminal, usually deadening, were now helping the sound. The notes bounced off the glass walls and the metal ceiling, creating a natural reverb that made the piano sound massive. It sounded like a full orchestra was playing, not just one man. The low notes vibrated in the floor tiles, humming up through the soles of people's shoes. You didn't just hear the music. You felt it in your bones. The ripple had turned into a wave. The people standing at the very edges of the crowd, the ones who were just passing through and didn't know what was happening, couldn't help but stop. It was impossible to walk past that wall of sound without being affected. It was like walking past a fire on a cold day. You had to stop and warm yourself. The gravitational pull of the piano was too strong. The flow of foot traffic through the terminal had been severed. A bottleneck was forming, but nobody was honking or complaining. Nobody was shouting, "Excuse me?" The hustle culture of the world had paused. The obsession with being on time had vanished. There was only the music. The man played a series of trills and fast turns that sounded like a bird fluttering its wings. It was incredibly fast, showing off a technical skill that would be impressive in a concert hall, let alone an airport. The crowd let out a collective murmur of appreciation. It wasn't a cheer, just a sound of wow. The man's face broke into a tiny, knowing smile for just a split second. He knew he had them. He knew that for these few minutes he wasn't just an old man in a coat. He was a conductor of human emotion. He was the master of the room. His baton was the keyboard. He was deep into the rhapsody now, weaving different themes together. The song felt like a journey. It had started with the blues, moved through the sadness, gone into the energetic jazz. Now it was building toward something bigger. The layers of sound were stacking up. The music was getting thicker, richer, and more complex. It demanded full attention. You couldn't listen to this with half an ear and look at your phone at the same time. It demanded you be present. And so, the people were present. They were there, in the moment, their screens dark, their mouths slightly open. Their breathing synchronized with the rhythm. The atmosphere was no longer cold and industrial. The space felt transformed. It felt like a sanctuary. The fluorescent lights overhead didn't seem so harsh anymore. The hard floor didn't feel so uncomfortable. The music had created a bee. The crowd was no longer just a group of people waiting for a flight. It had transformed into something else entirely. It was as if the piano had cast a spell over this specific corner of the terminal, creating an invisible bubble that separated them from the rest of the world. Inside this bubble, the air felt different. It felt charged with electricity. The usual coldness of the airport had been replaced by a warmth that radiated from the center of the room. People were standing shoulder to shoulder, but they didn't mind the lack of personal space. In fact, they seemed to draw comfort from it. The pressing together of strangers created a shared intimacy, a feeling that everyone was in this together. Witnessing something rare, the silence that fell over the group was not an empty silence. It was a heavy, listening silence. It was the kind of quiet you only find in places of worship or in a theater just before the movie starts. The only sounds were the ones coming from the piano, the sharp click of the keys hitting the bottom of the bed, the soft thud of the pedals on the floor, and the music itself, which was now bouncing off every wall and ceiling tile. The rest of the terminal still buzzed with its chaotic life, but to the people standing in the semicircle, that noise might as well have been on a different planet. The music had entered a new phase. It was no longer just a melody. It was a narrative. The old man was telling a story without using a single word. His hands moved independently of each other, creating a complex weave of sound that was astonishing to watch. His left hand was keeping a steady, rhythmic pulse, and the lower register a heartbeat that never wavered, while his right hand was flying across the high keys, playing runs of notes that were so fast they sounded like a cascade of sparkling water. It was a display of physical dexterity that seemed impossible for a man of his age. He should have been tired. He should have been slowing down. But instead, he seemed to be getting stronger. The emotional impact on the audience was visible on every face. There was a businessman standing near the front, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. He had his briefcase in one hand and his phone in the other. When the music started, he had been checking his emails, his face tense and stressed. But now, his arms had dropped to his sides. His phone was screened down in his palm, forgotten. He was staring at the old man's hands with his mouth slightly open. The tension in his forehead had smoothed out. For the first time that day, maybe for the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about work or money. He was just listening. The music had forced him to let go of his stress. Near the back of the crowd, a young woman was leaning against a pillar. She had been crying when she first arrived, maybe from a difficult goodbye, or perhaps just the overwhelming nature of travel. Tears were still streaking her face, but she wasn't sobbing anymore. She had a tissue pressed to her nose, but her eyes were fixed on the pianist with a look of awe. The sad, beautiful notes coming from the piano seemed to validate her feelings. The music was telling her that it was okay to be sad, that sadness can be beautiful too. It was a comforting presence. It's like a hand on her shoulder. One of the most beautiful things about the scene was the diversity of the people who had stopped. It was a true slice of humanity. There was a family from the Middle East, the mother in a headscarf holding onto a stroller, standing next to a group of teenagers in ripped jeans and colorful hair. There was a tourist wearing a "I love this city" t-shirt, standing next to a local pilot in full uniform. There were people speaking Chinese, Spanish, French, and English. And yet none of that mattered. The language barrier had been completely dissolved by the music. You didn't need to speak English to understand what the old man was saying with his hands. Everyone understood the language of emotion. A young boy, no older than 7 or 8, was standing right at the very front, practically pressing his nose against the side of the piano. He was wearing a backpack that looked almost as big as he was. He had a look of pure concentration on his face, his eyes darting back and forth between the man's hands and the keys. He was trying to figure out the magic trick. How did the man's hands move so fast? How did he know which notes to press? The boy's father stood behind him, resting his hands on his son's shoulders, gently squeezing them every now and then. It was a father-son moment created entirely by the music. The pianist himself was dripping with sweat now. The physical exertion of playing such a demanding piece was intense. A drop of sweat rolled down his temple and hung from his chin for a moment before falling onto his coat. He didn't notice. His breath was coming in short, sharp gasps between phrases. He was fighting for the music, giving it everything he had. He was leaning forward into the piano, attacking the keys with passion, then pulling back to stroke them gently. He was acting out the emotions of the song with his entire body. It was a performance of total commitment. He wasn't holding anything back. He was pouring his life force into the instrument. And the instrument was giving it back, amplified and beautiful. The music began to swell again. The old man's foot stomped on the loud pedal, and the sound suddenly filled the entire hall. It was a massive roaring sound that seemed to shake the floor. The crowd gasped. It was a sound of triumph, of overcoming obstacles. The melody was soaring, climbing higher and higher, full of energy and hope. It felt like the climax of a great movie. Everyone in the crowd felt their spirits lift. It was impossible to listen to this sound and feel depressed. It was a wave of pure joy that washed over the entire terminal. People started taking out their phones. Usually this is a sign of disengagement, people filming something just to post it online later. But this felt different. People were holding their phones up, but they were looking at the piano with their own eyes, not through the screen. They were recording it so they could remember this moment later, so they could prove to their friends that magic really exists in the world. The screens of the hundreds of phones created a constellation of tiny lights in the dim terminal, like a sea of stars floating over the crowd. It was a modern addition to a timeless scene. The ripple of the music had now reached people who couldn't even see the piano. There were people sitting at the gates, hundreds of feet away, who were stopping their conversations to listen. The sound carried through the open space, drifting up to the high ceilings and down the long corridors. It was drawing people in like a magnet. Someone who was rushing to catch a train slowed down, trying to find where the sound was coming from, tempted to miss their transport. Just to see the source of the beauty, the connection between the old man and the crowd was tangible. It was a feedback loop. He played something emotional, and the crowd leaned in, giving him their energy. He felt their attention, their respect, and it pushed him to play even better. He took risks with the music, adding extra flourishes, trills, and turns that weren't written on any page. He was improvising, speaking directly to them in the moment. It was a conversation, a two-way street of energy. He wasn't just performing for them. He was sharing his soul, and they were accepting it with open hearts. The tension in the music was building to a breaking point. The notes were getting faster, the rhythm was getting more complex, and the volume was rising. The old man's hands were a blur. He was playing a series of chords that required immense strength, slamming his hands down on the keys with total conviction, yet never losing control. The sound was thunderous now. It was a wall of sound that surrounded the crowd. The audience was breathless. You could feel the anticipation in the air. Everyone knew that this intensity couldn't last forever. They were approaching the peak of the mountain. The question on everyone's mind was, how would he land? How would he bring this massive, swirling storm of sound back down to earth? A little girl in a pink coat, who had been watching with wide eyes, reached out and grabbed her mother's hand. The mother squeezed back, both of them frozen in the moment. The music had taken them out of the boring airport and placed them in a dream. It was a reminder that even in the most mundane, industrial places on Earth, beauty can break through. Even in a place designed for transit and waiting, where people are just cargo moving from point A to point B, humanity can still shine. The old man in the tweed coat wasn't just playing a song. He was reminding everyone there that they were alive. The notes were cascading like a waterfall now, a torrent of sound that seemed to have no beginning and no end. The man's face was a mask of fierce joy. He looked young again. The years had dropped away from his face, leaving only the pure expression of the music. He was flying. The crowd was flying with him. The entire terminal was holding its breath, suspended in a moment of perfect, shared clarity. The captive audience was fully captured, locked in the grip of a melody that they would remember for the rest of their lives. The old man was about to bring it home, and everyone knew it was going to be spectacular.
The music had reached a fever pitch. The old man's hands were moving so fast now that they were almost a blur, a frantic dance of knuckles and fingertips across the black and white keys. The sound was no longer just a melody. It was a physical force. It was a storm of sound that filled the entire terminal, vibrating the floor tiles, rattling the windows, and resonating deep inside the chest of everyone standing there. The complexity of the notes was stunning, weaving together threads of jazz, classical, and blues into a tapestry that felt larger than life. He was playing with a fierce intensity, his body swaying back and forth, his head bobbing to the rhythm. Every muscle in his face was focused, his eyes squeezed shut, as if he were seeing the music in colors and shapes behind his eyelids. The crowd was holding its collective breath. It felt like the entire room was suspended in a single moment of high tension. No one looked at their watch. No one checked their phone for messages. All the worries about missed connections, delayed flights, and business meetings had evaporated. There was only the sound of the piano, rising and falling like a massive ocean wave. The man threw his whole body into the instrument, attacking the high notes with sharp, precise strikes, then diving down to the low end to pull out deep, rumbling chords that shook the air. He was sweating heavily now, his white handkerchief forgotten in his pocket, his hair damp under his tweed cap. Then it happened. The music began its final descent. The man's hands slowed down just fractionally, signaling to the crowd that the climax was approaching. He started to play a series of repeating chords, building the volume up, louder and louder, driving the rhythm like a hammer on an anvil. The crowd leaned in, drawn forward by the sheer power of the sound. You could feel the anticipation crackling in the air like static electricity. It was the feeling of being on a roller coaster just as it reaches the very top of the highest hill that paused before the drop. The man's foot slammed down on the sustained pedal, holding it down, opening the piano up to its full voice. With a sudden, explosive burst of energy, his hands flew across the keys for the final run. It was a cascade of sound, a waterfall of notes that seemed to encompass every emotion he had played so far: sadness, joy, anger, peace, all wrapped up in one final, triumphant shout. He struck the final 3 chords with authority. Bam, bam, bam. The sound was huge, echoing off the high ceiling and the glass walls, bouncing back and forth as the room seemed to shake. And then silence, but it wasn't the empty silence of before. It was a heavy, ringing silence. The man kept his hands pressed down on the keys, letting the final notes sustain, holding the sound in the air for as long as possible. The vibration hummed in everyone's ears. The crowd stood frozen, staring at the stage, unwilling to break the spell. For 3, maybe 4 seconds, no one moved. It was as if the music had stunned them all, leaving them breathless and suspended in time. The air felt thick with the ghost of the melody. Slowly, the old man lifted his hands off the keys. The last echoes of the sound faded away into the vastness of the terminal. He opened his eyes. He blinked a few times, looking around as if he was waking up from a deep sleep. For a moment he looked confused, as if he didn't know where he was or why hundreds of people were staring at him. Then reality seemed to rush back in. The spell broke. The applause didn't start slowly. It exploded. It started as a roar from the front row and spread backward like a wave of fire. People clapped, they cheered, they whistled. It was a deafening sound, surprising in a place where people usually try to be quiet and polite. Hands slapped together so hard they stung. Strangers turned to strangers, grinning from ear to ear, sharing a look of disbelief and delight. The tension that had been building up was released all at once in a chaotic burst of appreciation. The businessman in the suit was clapping vigorously, a huge smile on his face. The mother with the baby was wiping a tear from her cheek while clapping with one hand. The teenagers were shouting "Bravo!" and "Encore!" The old man on the bench looked genuinely shocked. He turned his head left and right, scanning the wall of people surrounding him. A shy, sheepish smile spread across his face, wrinkling his cheeks and crinkling the corners of his eyes. He didn't stand up and take a theatrical bow like a concert star. Instead, he just nodded his head, a simple gesture of acknowledgement. He looked down at his hands, perhaps a little embarrassed by all the attention. He seemed to be a man who played for the love of the music, not for the fame. He reached up and adjusted his beret, wiping a trickle of sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. The applause continued for a long time. People didn't want it to stop. They didn't want to go back to their normal lives just yet. The connection in the room was so strong that no one wanted to break it. But eventually the man knew it was time. He slowly stood up from the bench. His knees clicked slightly, a reminder of his age, but he stood tall. He placed his hands on his hips and took a deep breath, letting it out with a sigh of satisfaction. He looked at the piano one last time, patting the glossy lid affectionately, like he would pat a dog that had just done a good trick. He reached down to the floor and picked up his small, battered suitcase. It looked heavier now, or maybe he was just tired after the performance. He swung the handle over his shoulder. The crowd began to part for him, making a pathway. It was a path of respect. As he walked down the steps of the platform, people reached out to pat him on the back or shake his hand. He accepted their touches with a humble nod and a quiet thank you to those who got close enough. He didn't stop to sign autographs. He didn't pull out his own phone to record the moment. He just kept walking, moving through the sea of admirers like a ghost returning to the shadows. He walked away from the piano, merging back into the flow of the airport. He walked past the coffee shop, past the security checkpoint toward the departure gates. Within moments, he was just another person in the crowd, indistinguishable from the thousands of other travelers. The magician had disappeared, leaving only the memory of the trick behind. The crowd didn't disperse immediately. They stayed in their semicircle, looking at the empty piano. It sat there, silent and black, looking smaller now than it had when he was playing. It was just a piece of furniture again. But the energy around it was still buzzing. People were talking to each other, strangers conversing as if they were old friends. "Did you hear that?" one man asked. "That was incredible," a woman replied. "I wonder who he was," someone else said. Nobody knew. Nobody had ever seen him before, and chances were they would never see him again. That mystery made the moment even more special. Slowly, the reality of the terminal began to creep back in. The announcer's voice came over the speakers, calling out a flight boarding at gate 14. The spell was fully broken. People began to check their watches. The anxiety about travel time started to return. The businessman looked at his phone and realized he was late. The mother picked up her diaper bag. The teenagers put their headphones back on. The crowd began to drift away, going back to their gates, their lines, and their worries. The circle dissolved, and the river of rushing people started flowing through the area again. But even as the terminal returned to its normal chaotic rhythm, something had changed. The atmosphere felt lighter. The grayness of the airport seemed to have been lifted, at least for a little while. The harsh fluorescent lights didn't feel as cold. The concrete floor didn't feel as hard. There was a lingering sense of wonder in the air, a shared secret that everyone who had stopped to listen now carried with them for the next hour. People walked past that piano with a different look in their eyes. They didn't ignore it anymore. They glanced at it with a kind of reverence. A few people even walked up and touched the keys, pressing them gently, maybe hoping that a little bit of the magic would transfer to their fingers. But of course the magic wasn't in the piano. The magic had been in the old man, in his passion, and in his ability to make 1,000 strangers stop and feel something real together. The terminal filled up again, with new travelers who hadn't seen the performance. To them, it was just another noisy airport. But for the people who had been there, for the crowd that had stood in the semicircle and held their breath, the memory would stay. It would be the story they told their friends when they got home. It would be the bright spot in a tiring day of travel. It was a reminder that beauty can appear anywhere, even in the most unlikely of places. The empty piano sat waiting. It waited for the next person to sit down. It waited for the next set of hands to bring it to life. But everyone knew, deep down, that it would be a long time before anything like that happened again. The empty piano in the terminal was just a piano again, but for those few minutes it had been the center of the world. And the man in the tweed coat was gone, a mystery who had drifted in, touched their hearts, and drifted out, leaving behind nothing but the fading echo of a melody that had stopped a crowd.